Hickory, Dickory, Dock. You won't hear those words again anywhere else in this review except in reference to the title, because in this book there is no mouse, no clock, just a hostel on Hickory Road, a road whose name bears no relevance to anything else in the novel, is hardly ever mentioned, and apparently was not even named that until this novel was named. Funny side note there, I don't really pay that close attention to the performance, so to speak, of my YouTube videos, but some of my worst performing videos in terms of how far people make it into the video before they leave are Agatha Christie reviews. And not just any Agatha Christie reviews, but the ones where the title is the name of a still popular nursery rhyme. Apparently poor kids are searching for the rhyme, 1, 2, buckle my shoe, and instead clicking on a video of some guy talking about a dentist who's been killed by one of his patients. Anyway, this novel was kind of a fun one for me. Was it a good mystery? Not really. Actually, it was quite bad. Although some of the clues and investigation threads were interesting and original, it ultimately adds up to something quite underwhelming with a solution that kind of just feels pulled out of a hat of random possibilities. Especially because there are a lot of characters in this one, all of whom have done a lot of potentially suspicious things. Part of what I liked most about this novel, though, was the setting of it. Hickory Dickory Dock takes place in a hostel in London, where most of the characters are students, and after reading quite a few novels recently about country estate murders and all that, including actually the next one in the series Dead Man's Folly, which I ended up reading before this one, but I've been withholding the review until I finish this one. But this one really felt like a fresh setting. And because of this, I actually felt like the novel had its own feel. It transported me to its setting, which is something I really value in a novel, and can often salvage a detective novel even when the mystery itself feels a little subpar. In fact, I'd venture to say that Christie at this point in the Poirot series was getting better at this, because earlier in the series, the ones that best carried this sense of time and place were the destination mysteries, as I think of them. Your Death on the Nile, Murder in Mesopotamia, Appointment with Death. But at this point, it feels like she's starting less to need some specific geographical or tourism anchor to establish a strong and compelling setting. I mean, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, because After the Funeral was not that great in this regard. But actually, the next book, Dead Man's Folly, I found pretty strong, actually, despite being just a country house murder mystery. In any case, I really enjoyed the overall feel of Hickory Dickory Dock because it keeps it from blending in with all the other novels in my mind. And also, because of the setting at a student hostel, introduces a very different cast of characters than we often get in these novels. They're primarily younger adults who are staying at this hostel, and they're from a much wider variety of backgrounds than usual. Plus, even the other characters, well, anyone who enjoys the David Suchet Poirot TV adaptations will be delighted to see the return of Miss Lemon at the start of this novel. And I say return, but actually now that I think about it, I'm not sure if she's ever been in a novel before this one. I can only specifically remember her appearing before this point in one of the short stories in a short story collection. Possibly that was How Does Your Garden Grow? Okay, a quick Google search, which admittedly might not be correct because I only took 5 seconds, brings up Hickory Dickory Dock when I ask what is Miss Lemon's first novel. So let's tentatively go with that. Of course, though Miss Lemon is certainly intriguing in the books, I've found so far from reading about her that she really was developed to take on a much larger role in the TV adaptations than she does here, which in my opinion is a really good thing for those adaptations because she's really a fun and interesting character there. Side note on that though, the TV adaptation of this particular novel is quite possibly the very worst one of the 20 or so Poirot novel adaptations I've seen so far. I mean, it's bad as a mystery, as a story, even as a study in cinematography. We spent at least 5 minutes of camera time following this mouse around whose sole purpose in the film is to run up a clock and justify the story's otherwise inexplicable title. Not to mention pretty much everything else is bad too, including a reveal scene that's even more drawn out than usual, to the point where I was feeling not suspense, but just boredom. As for the other characters, I have mixed feelings. Not just ambivalent feelings, but I have both positive and negative feelings about those characters. I mean, as I mentioned, we're certainly seeing a bunch of different characters than the sort of jaded aristocrats or bickering married couples that we've seen in recent works. And some of these characters are pretty fun and interesting, with personalities that emerge as we get to know them. Of course, as I'll get to more in the spoiler section, this is slightly undermined by the fact that by the end it'll be a muddle as to which characters are who they say they are, and for which ones it's entirely a facade, but we'll get there, I guess. And okay, it's not actually that bad to tell these characters apart. Also, while it is what it is, this is one of the few Christie novels I've read where the novel, when read in a 21st century context, feels truly awkward in the way it portrays foreigners, particularly those of certain racial backgrounds. Now, I know Christie at the time probably thought of it as quite an open-minded novel with an ethnically diverse cast of characters, and in which characters' stereotypes of one another and discrimination against foreigners are openly challenged in the novel itself. And if nothing else, this knowledge makes it easy to rule out a few people as actual murderers. But ironically, she falls into writing characters that, while defying the old stereotypes of the time, instead just play into a whole new set of stereotypes. And in particular, the Middle Eastern and African characters don't come out very favorably, and even the Italian Geronimo becomes a bit of a mockery, though he certainly gets it better than the other characters. And by the way, to some extent, some of these characters could be seen as satirical characters rather than genuinely typecast to represent foreigners. Like, you have to read between the lines a little bit to tell to what extent Christie feels like, oh, this is the way that such people really are, versus kind of making jokes that do play into stereotypes but are sort of an all-in-good fun thing. In particular, though, Akibombo, the West African character, probably will come off the worst to modern audiences. He speaks broken English, which is understandable given his background, but because of this, he comes across as basically simple-minded or a comic fool because he can't seem to ever understand what's going on. And it's a little weird because this is challenged a bit later on when his American friend, Sally, who basically guides him during the novel to help him better understand what's going on, observes basically that he's much smarter than he seems based on his command of the language alone. I mean, it seems like Christie's trying to show, look, you thought this character is kind of a clown, but he's been underestimated. But it's kind of a backhanded compliment. It's like if you were to say nowadays that someone who's non-white is very well-spoken, with the implication that they're an exception to the norm for their race. So while I think he's a character written with good intentions, he still feels quite stereotypical in a negative way. The political leanings of the hostel's residents also receive a particularly unsubtle treatment, this time from Christie. Chandra Lal, a highly political and sort of racial activist Indian character, is dismissed by Poirot as suffering from persecution mania, and perhaps many readers will agree with Poirot here, but it does feel too quick in writing off a character who opposes the racial status quo in England. I'll leave this discussion all at that, but if you want to think about it further, I think Mara from the channel Books Like Whoa, who's done reviews on every single Poirot novel and its historical context, gave an insightful and balanced analysis of what's going on in this book, so I'd suggest you check it out, and I'll post a link to that video below. About that mystery again, though. Let me step back, though, and clarify, because when I say it wasn't a very good mystery, I'm referring more to the way everything develops and plays out in the end. If we were to consider just the setup, the first half of the book in which the mystery is developed, I'd say it's quite strong with some original concepts. I'm not going to get into spoilers yet, but I'm not spoiling anything when I say that a really intriguing starting point of this novel is the list of seemingly unrelated missing items. Poirot hears from Miss Lemon, who hears from her sister, who works at the student hostel, that a lot of items have gone missing. And this list of items that have gone missing is intriguing for multiple reasons and becomes sort of the first gateway into a deeper investigation. But why I think that the setup is better than the actual unfolding of the mystery is that here, unlike in some other novels when Poirot's inferences seem baffling at first, but when we're then awed when he reveals his clever reasoning, in Hickory Dickory Dock, you probably still won't be able to buy into all of Poirot's interpretations. It just seems like he's reading people's minds, or getting really lucky with his guesswork. Now, to talk about what those interpretations are, that's going to be my cue to get started in the spoiler-filled section. So it's time to make your getaway if you still want to read this novel and try to figure it out yourself. And God bless you if you do, because, well, you might be able to find out the killer in this one, but good luck figuring out the motive. Good luck. Okay, spoilers starting now. So for me, the missing items list, while intriguing, ended up being mostly a miss in its overall execution. Somehow from this list of seemingly unrelated items, Poirot is able to infer that the residents of this hostel are in grave danger. I can sort of buy that he sees some common trends among different groups of items and wonders if they were all stolen by the same person. However, there are a lot of different interpretations or classifications that one could imagine for these items, and it seems like Poirot's ability to parse it all out is almost magic. Granted, there are some pieces of information that take a little while to unravel, like when Celia, one of the students, is able to remove about half the items from the list. It certainly sheds some light on the reason for the remaining items being stolen. But this is just one example. Much more than usual in this novel, Poirot's investigation feels like Deus Ex Machina rather than brilliantly clever detective. In fact, this finding a commonality between a list of stolen items, which it turns out in the end there really isn't a commonality, I think this was done a lot more interestingly in one of G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown short stories. I remember it was in his first collection, The Innocence of Father Brown, but I forget the exact story that it was. I'll mention it in the description if I can figure it out. I'd go as far, though, as to concede that this mystery plot can still be pretty entertaining if you're not actually trying to solve it, but instead just seeing what happens, if you treat it as more of a thriller novel than a puzzle mystery, which ultimately is kind of what I started doing by the middle of the novel. Although I originally had some suspicions of Colin, By the middle of the novel, I was no longer so sure about him. Problem for me, though, with this way of reading the novel is that the story is clearly framed from the start as a puzzle mystery, and the reader is clearly invited to solve this mystery. Like, we're given a list of items and told, solve this. It's suggested to us that the mystery should be solvable. Therefore, there's more potential for frustration and disappointment when it turns out to be very difficult to solve. In this way, I'll contrast it with another upcoming novel I've read also by the time I'm writing this review, and which I'll also be talking about before too long, Cat Among the Pigeons, in which we get a very clear sense from the start that there's going to be some craziness, and that Christie might play fast and loose with the plot details. And in that case, I really enjoyed it since I felt it was signaled from the start. Try to figure out what's going on, but don't try too hard because it's going to be a crapshoot in the end. There are also some red herrings as well as actual clues that aren't so great. Like the fact that only a few people could have stolen the medicine/poison bottle from the pharmacy. Irrelevant, because it turns out that not just the medical students, but absolutely anyone is able to walk into that pharmacy dressed as a doctor and take the poison, or visit a friend there. The multiple bottles of poisons and non-poisons that have been switched around with one another to the point where the reader will have difficulty remembering which is which. It feels like too much of a coincidence for one thing, and more annoying than puzzling, since the mystery still could have been plenty interesting without this touch. And then there's this thing with someone intentionally spilling ink on Elizabeth Johnston's papers. Not only is that pretty much irrelevant and a distraction by the end, but it's so convoluted that after thinking about it a bit, we'll probably just throw up our hands and say, I don't know who did it, because again, anyone could have done it. And it just comes down to who secretly wants whom to think that they did it because they would have had access to the ink, but then they really didn't because they just wanted. It's ridiculous. On the other hand, one interesting development that I think worked out all right was at the time of the murder, when Nigel receives a call while present with the detectives to learn of the murder that he in fact just committed. This whole scenario will probably start feeling a little bit sketchy to many seasoned Christie readers, and while it didn't convince me that Nigel was guilty, I mean, what's his motive after all? It at least made me start to consider it a very real possibility. The most annoying part of the mystery for me, though, is all the ways in which the outside world and the histories of these characters that we could really know nothing about seep into the story and basically provide the unexplained motive for our boy Nigel and his sweetheart Victoria to be killing their roommates right and left. We've got a diamond smuggling ring. We've also got a crime committed as a child but covered up yet still known to some people. And did I mention the communists? Lots and lots of communists, or possible communists, whom we can assume are probably irrelevant to the overall plot, but still, being able to explain everything suspicious with, oh, she could be a killer, or she could be a communist, it doesn't exactly make for straightforward or interesting detective work and deductions. In general, though, political intrigues aside, I'm just never a fan of these explanations where some vague allusions to past events come back later out of nowhere and provide the entire explanation for the crime. To me, it's not interesting and it just feels like a lazy development. The possible exception to that would have been in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, where it's told to us from the beginning that this is what we're looking for. Although in that story, I still found for other reasons that it wasn't so well done. And I'm not sure if that means Christie went astray with this device, but possibly could have made it work, or if it's just further proof that this doesn't make for the most interesting mystery. It can at least be said, though, that the characters who turn out to be the culprits are not particularly likable ones. I would have had even more trouble buying the solution if some random, seemingly benevolent character like the ultimately forgettable Elizabeth Johnston turned out to be the guilty one in the end. All things considered, though, I can at least give it to Hickory, Dickory, Dock that it's not an entirely forgettable novel. It stands out for reasons both good and bad, and while that means I can't rank it among Christie's best, it was at least interesting to read. What did you think of the novel? Were you somehow able to cobble together your knowledge of children's nursery rhymes and mouse behavior to discover an ingenious clue that led you to the solution? Were you more impressed than I was by the complexity, or if you want to be less generous, convolutedness of this plot? Let me know, and you can look forward to several more of these Poirot reviews soon, since I've in fact already filmed my next review as well. Until then, though, happy reading.